Pivoting with track is a move that shares a number of technical similarities with pivoting and editing, which is why it has the same name. In pivoting, we would create overlapping groups by placing cameras that each have a particular character visible in both shots, preferably in the same part of the frame, which would smooth out the cut and create spatial continuity. Pivoting on track can do the same by replacing those two lock cameras with one on a track, and actually tracking between the two positions. The effect is that we keep the man locked in the same part of the frame during the move while the background is being replaced. But while the end result in this case is the same as with pivot editing, this is where the similarities end, because pivoting with track is such an essential move that it deserves to stand on its own. The key distinction in pivoting is that we're locking onto something as we move and keep it fixed in the frame. This is an effective way to reveal something, which we'll look at in the next chapter. But in this chapter, we'll look at using it to follow a second character while pivoting around the first. As the woman walks, we pivot on the man to keep her in the frame. We're essentially countering around the man, and the result is that we keep both characters in the frame almost no matter where the woman moves, as long as the man is stationary. So a pivot is really able to cover an entire scene between two characters, and it can be useful to base the whole coverage on one pivoting camera as a backbone, and then add locked reverses to fill in at each stop. So let's create 3 stops for the woman, starting at the door, then in front of the man, then over here, and add 2 locked reverses. As the woman walks from the door into the scene, we then pivot around the man. And as she comes to a stop, we cut to the first lock reverse. Back in the pivot, the woman walks to her second mark, and we keep countering around the man until she arrives, and we cut to the other locked reverse. As the scene goes on, we've covered almost 180 degrees of movement, the pivot camera works throughout the scene, and the 2 easy locked reverses fill in the coverage. So this is one useful move. The range of movement a pivot can cover is actually even wider. Here the woman walks to stand in front of the man, which is the same as we just did. As she walks in and out of the depth of the shot, we of course don't need to move. But we do again as she moves over here. So the woman can in fact move around the whole area in the top of the screen, which makes basing an entire scene on a pivot as a backbone very flexible. But pivots are also great problem solvers on a much smaller scale if we add pivots to tracks that are already laid in order to cover extra character movement. Here we track with the man between 2 keyframes. As the man now walks to the table, we reuse the track to cover him with a pivot. And back again. This can be done almost as soon as we have a track in the scene and regardless of how it's laid. As we arrive by the red woman, the move would ordinarily have ended here. But because the man needs to walk to the table, we simply tack on a pivot. This move can be easily added to most tracks and often be put in at the last minute because the track is already there. An even simpler version of this that does need to be planned is to pivot what would otherwise have been a locked reverse. Here we'll put this locked reverse on a track and pivot as the red man leaves. He stops on the way out, which the pivot covers easily, and as he leaves we pivot around to the front of the blue man. Putting the locked reverse on a track is naturally better than doing 2 separate shots because we only have 1 shot to do. So as the camera has now been locked throughout the scene, we pivot with the red man as he leaves, stopping here. When he leaves completely, we use the remaining track to pivot around to the front of the blue man, which creates the same kind of reaction shot feeling that a close push would. If we set this up differently, we could of course capture both a reaction and the other character leaving. Here we're again in half of a reverse pair, although this camera is on a track. As the red man leaves, we pivot around to the front of the blue man, getting both a reaction and covering the red man leaving. Since pivoting is so close to converging and countering, most of the same logic applies. Here we want the woman's entry to be more hectic, and as we oppose her movement, we're really doing a converge pivot counter, and it's hard to tell which one because they're so similar. What makes a move a pivot is simply that we lock onto something and counter around it. But to extend this idea, we can really lock onto anything we want. So let's pivot around the woman instead. As the man walks, she's now the fix. So for these bits of movement, the scene revolves around her. A converge also easily turns into a pivot if the track is angled. A straight converge by itself compresses the attention of the scene. But if we angle the track, the move becomes a pivot converge. As we converge, we're now moving more to the right as the woman moves more to the left, keeping the man fixed in the right side of the frame. Angling the track like this adds even more to the energy of the converge because the passing background creates unrest. Needless to say, we don't have to be pivoting around people. If a character's moving, we can pick a foreground object to pivot around. Here we've picked an arbitrary foreground object. We can just leave it at that, but we might as well pick an object that has significance in the scene later on. In this scene, we're really just countering on the man as he walks to the woman, but by starting on the pumpkin, which is a completely arbitrary object, the first half of the move becomes a pivot. Because these moves are so similar, it's extremely easy to go from one to the other. Even with the red man not visible yet, it's still a pivot, which then becomes a counter. Combinations like these can be quite elegant. Another interesting way to pivot around objects is to pivot around a gap in the foreground. Here we counter the man's movement by pivoting around the hole in the wall. If he walks back, we simply pivot in the opposite direction.